Hi, I'm Jamie. This is Dead Dodge Garage, and this is a 340 Cuda. See? Cuda! It's so orange, but it also has a bunch of black, and that's a great combination. Look at all these options. Just look at them. Also, the tag's weird, but apparently that's because LA plant. It's got pins, it's got fog lights. Now, I wouldn't go so far as to call this car loaded or anything, but it does have a bunch of nice options. Buckets, console with a floor shifter. It's got an 8-track, 3-speaker dash to go along with that. Hockey stick stripes, nice. It's got disc brakes hiding behind 15-inch rally wheels, and you can tell those are original because the car has the special steel spacer shims under the lower bump stops that are only found on original 15-inch wheel cars. I don't actually know, but I suspect the same is true on Cudas as on Challengers, which have special fenders for 15-inch wheels as well. I believe the cutout inside is shaped ever so slightly differently. For that reason, those fenders are found on Hemi cars, which only came with 15s, and therefore they're very expensive. There was actually apparently a thing at Chrysler with orange and black cars being produced on Halloween, so we did go ahead and check the scheduled production date on this one. It was in April. Under the hood, as mentioned, a 340 cubic inch small block. This was one of the greatest power plants ever built by Chrysler in the muscle car era, although there were some other very good ones as well. Because it's a 1970, it has some special features too. For one thing, it's orange. Starting late in 1971, the 340 was actually blue like a 318, but this one is still orange. And because it's a 1970, it has the special high-performance 340 manifolds. If you're familiar with small block setups, you can tell that this passenger side manifold in particular is very unique. The collector is way farther down, it's angled, and the different parts of it are kind of spread out. The center section is way longer than on the standard small block manifolds. Beginning in 1971, they use a more standard exhaust manifold, just like a 318, except they're slightly larger inside and they have a larger flange. There are other special 340 details to find here as well. For one thing, the plug wire holders. Note this and this, which is missing its plastic for some reason. Despite being a small block without air conditioning, this car was ordered with a 26-inch radiator, which you can confirm by looking right here on the second build tag. That's right, it's a 2-tag car. And seeing the number 26. All kinds of cool details to find here, like this aged vehicle emissions sticker. Also, original brake booster. There's a partial factory blackout behind the grille still, although the fender section is orange. It appears the car was painted, and it must have been painted with the fenders off. Hopefully you can see the nice light metallic in the paint. It reminds me of that orange convertible Challenger I did a video on a couple months back, although that one was even shinier. Being in 1970, these rallies have the earlier style center cap, which is light argent. In 71, those center caps were painted dark argent, even though the wheel was still light argent. There does appear to be a slight color mismatch here, but I think that's just from age. Has anyone else ever noticed that Toyota Corollas in the 90s have a similar style wheel to the rally wheel? Or is that just me? Of course, you can't forget the obligatory gill trim. That's neat. Also a little aged. I kind of like that. You may have noticed the car has electronic ignition. This appears to have been a direct connection kit, judging by what that harness looks like and the way it's tagged into the car. The module is in the correct location that would be found on a later E-body, but generally this module would be mounted to a bracket because it doesn't quite fit above that line there. Yep, definitely a Mopar Performance kit, as you can tell by the sticker on the distributor. A factory one would never have that. Apparently someone was having charging issues and they added a ground wire for the voltage regulator. It's not that that's a bad idea by any means, but, well, it could have been black. And also, tight bolts would probably help get a good ground. I did notice the surround ring for the blower motor is missing. Notice this 70 E-body has the cowl covers screwed down. In later years, those are clipped in place. And even though they have screw holes, there usually aren't screws. Of course, it's got the bulged Cuda hood, which is one of the coolest performance pieces ever fit into a car, I think. It's a 70 Cuda, so it's a single headlight model. Of course, in 71, it would have duals, which is really, really neat. And then in 72, they went back to a front-end design very much like this one. If you look closely, you'll notice a couple little dings and scratches and touch-up spots and things like that. Also, a very slightly frumpy area here on the vinyl top. Overall, it's a nice car. Looks like it was well restored some years back, and this is a great quality driver. Fuzzy dice. Nice. Air compressor. Anyway, why is this thing here? Well, it turns out it doesn't run. We were told that the owner believed it had no spark because it would crank, but it wouldn't fire up. It was brought here on a tow truck, and the tow truck driver noticed when he pulled this thing out of the driveway and up his truck, there was random mysterious fluid pouring out of the front of the engine. We thought that was kind of odd, so we pulled the engine oil dipstick. And here's what we found. The crankcase is massively, massively over full. And believe it or not, it kind of smells like gas. Now there is actually fuel up to the carburetor, so we may have a spark issue. And maybe someone tried to start this like, I don't know, 100 times and poured a bunch of fuel down it and it just washed past the rings and ended up in the oil. Maybe. But there's also mysterious liquid seeping all over the fuel pump, and it looks like it's been doing that for quite a while, so pretty sure we've got a torn diaphragm in there. It's been leaking out of the vent and it's just pouring into the engine crankcase. That's not good. So today we're gonna put a new fuel pump on this thing, and then we're gonna change the oil before we ever try to start this. Because as it turns out, gasoline does not make a very good lubricant for your engine's bearings. Just for science, I decided to do a spark check. Because this thing has Mopar electronic ignition, with the key on and then turned off, you'll get one single spark. Another way to do that is turn the key on and then disconnect the battery terminal like so. And when I do that, we get a very healthy spark. I mean, it's an MSD coil, so it should be healthy. And you probably won't be able to see this, but when the engine cranks, we get tons and tons of spark. Here we are under the car, and you can see the oil everywhere, although I did wipe some of it already for a sniff test. It's just kind of a mess. You can see the one drip line right there at the front of the pan. Again, I'm fairly sure what happened is this thing was angled down the driveway when it was picked up. The super high level of oil hit that end seal, which is clearly dry rotted, and it all started pouring out. Actually, that trail leads all the way to the front seal, so that's interesting. Also, notice the back sides of those bolts in the harmonic balancer pulley. You really got to watch it when you get aftermarket bolts. These are way too long. They don't quite hit the metal shield on the back side that covers the seal, but they're very close. Here's another angle looking at the fuel pump, and you can see there is kind of some residue around the flare fitting there. I thought that could have been the source of the leak, but it actually seems to be traveling from that crimp much higher above, and it's just sort of collecting on everything. All right, I think this thing actually has a bad front crank seal. Look at this mess gathered on the lower hose. There's a similar mess up on the bottom of the water pump, if you can see that. Oh, yeah, there you go. So that's not ideal. Probably needs one of those. And some of that mess may be front seal related as well. We're still gonna go ahead and replace the pump. For science, we're gonna drain whatever's in this oil sump into this clear plastic tub. Evan actually marked this with a gallon line for a previous project, so we'll be able to kind of sort of gauge how much fluid is in there. I wanted to show you this before I actually get the plug all the way out. Notice I've loosened it a couple threads, and there's a pretty good drip coming out. See how watery that looks? That is not regular oil. Regular oil will not sneak past your threads quite like that. You may get a very, very slow drip, but it's not gonna be like this. That's always a good indicator there's something in your oil that shouldn't be. Look at the way that stuff flows. It flows like water or gasoline. Whew, yep, that's gasoline. Look at that. It should not do that. Okay, here we go. Whee! That's a good time to be right in front of the camera. You're welcome. By the way, this engine is totally cold. If this was just oil, it would not be peeing out with such energy, ferocity. Look at that, dude. There's hardly any oil in that. Ugh. Suddenly I have to pee. So remember our gallon line? We're getting pretty close to 3 gallons here, and it's still going. So it's not that this is 100% scientific or anything, but here's that 1 gallon line, and here's where we ended up. That appears to be almost 3 gallons of fluid in the crankcase. There's a bit of oil in it, but not much. We're letting as much as possible drain out before we continue. You know, the good news is now we have like 3 gallons of mixed gas for revivals. The other reason we drain this stuff into the tub, easy inspection for debris. I'm gonna fish around in there with the magnet in a minute here, and we'll shine a light in it, look for excessive sparkles. If this engine has actually run with majority gas for lubricant, that could do some pretty serious damage in some situations. As thin as this stuff is, and as much as there was, it's a small wonder it found every possible place to leak out of this engine. Well, not much steel in that oil, Of course, the magnet's not going to pick up bearing material, chunks of aluminum or whatever else those things are made out of. But that's at least kind of a good sign. Has anyone ever seen an 8 3/4 pinion seal that didn't leak? I've actually seen this a few times in the past, and I am kind of in the habit of checking for it these days. The best one I ever saw was in a V6 Dakota with a no spark situation. The owner didn't really know stuff and had pulled the injectors out. He reinstalled them with no lower O-ring seals. So every single time he turned the truck on, when the pump primed, it just dumped gas into the throttle body. When we finally figured out the spark issue, that truck would run on the oil in the crankcase seeping around the rings. It was the craziest thing I've ever seen. Pulling the filter, it's not even all the way loose yet and it started piddling. It was pretty impressive actually. Someone in a comment or a message or something told me recently they couldn't get the oil filter off of their small block without removing a torsion bar or something equally nuts. Anyway, that filter will come right out through the top. Okay, actually on this car I was able to get it out all the way back here, barely. And then more horrible oily gas went everywhere. Dude, that should not sound like that. If we had a filter cutter on hand, we'd open this thing up and check it for debris. We don't, for some reason. But anyway, hopefully everything's fine. Our shiny new Mopar oil filter just about fit right in there, so that's cool. Also, I tightened this one, but I didn't full-on gorilla He-Man torque it like the last guy did. You're welcome, future me, or whoever. Now you would think having this thing up on the lift would yield easy access to the fuel pump, but you'd be wrong. I'm gonna put it back on the ground to change that. It's almost impossible to reach from this angle. There's a radiator hose, a K-frame, a sway bar, a strut rod, and a plastic splash guard all perfectly in the way. It's hours later and we're back with the right replacement fuel pump. Yay. All right, now I get to cover myself in gas and probably oil while I'm at it. New fuel pump is installed, not that you can really see that. I went to reconnect the frame fuel line to it and I realized that is a chunk of 3/8 line, which is pretty old and nasty. And also horribly squishy and swollen and nasty. And as I tried to screw the clamp down, I could not get this tight to the pump and it just kind of ripped open. These use a 5/16 fuel line and a pump that's set up for 5/16 hose. So I switched to a chunk of that. Now I'm cutting it, attaching it. We should be in much better shape there. It's also a multi-fuel hose, so hopefully it'll last for years to come. Fuel lines are on, pump install is complete. And there must be something horribly wrong because the steel line there that goes up to the filter and carburetor on top, that inverted flare fitting screwed right together on the first try, and that never happens. And now, last but not least, I'm pouring in our shiny new oil. This is Lucas Hot Rod and Classic 1030. It's a high ZDDP content oil that's supposed to be good for classic engines like this one. Note, there is no modern oil rating circle marker thingy. It would say like SN or something. It can't be SN rated because it has that high zinc. This stuff cannot be used in engines that have catalytic converters behind them for that reason. If you've got an oil that says something like Hot Rod and Classic and it doesn't have that circle, you know you're using the right thing. Always a good idea to check and make sure your shiny new oil isn't pouring right back out the bottom. Don't worry about those couple drips, that's an unrelated thing. Note, I did not replace the front seal or any other gasket on this engine. The hope is, now that we've got engine oil that's slightly thicker than water, it won't have such a tendency to just run out everywhere it can. But we're gonna find out. Notice, I just full sent 5 quarts and it reads slightly over full right now. By the time it fills the oil filter, we should be perfect. I don't know if I brought any attention to the orange spark plug wires. Those were actually factory-on electronic ignition cars, and of course this really isn't one, but it has electronic ignition now. For whatever reason, one older black plug wire has been swapped back onto the number 6 there. The one they removed is in this bag with a battery hold down that I'm pretty sure does not fit with that giant battery they shoved in this thing. Anyway, it'll be interesting to get this thing fired up, which I'm just about ready to do, and find out if it has any misfires, if it has horribly fouled plugs, if the choke is messed up, if there's a massive tuning issue, or anything else like that. All right, here's my first attempt at firing it up. Something tells me I probably don't need to pump the gas at all. Oh, it burped a little. It doesn't sound good. I couldn't hear the engine at all from inside the car, but it felt all shaky and vibraty, and I heard some mild popping. Here's what it sounds like just turning over. It's got a mini starter, so it doesn't sound normal anyway. It just kind of sounds weak. The light popping out the carburetor tells me that shiny new distributor was probably just installed, and it was probably installed 180 degrees out. Here's how I'm going to verify that. I'm going to pull out the number 1 spark plug, bump the engine over to feel for compression, and when we get there, we'll line up the timing mark and see where the rotor's pointing. I'm going to guess it is not pointing at plug wire number 1. So I bumped it over, felt compression coming out of the number 1 hole on my finger, and I stopped right when the mark was a little bit past, which is good enough to tell me what I need to know. That rotor should be pointing roughly forward or that way a little bit, and it's pointed backwards. So that distributor is definitely 180 out. I'm going to pull the body of the distributor up, flip the rotor around, drop it right back in, put the cap back on, and then see what we get. We're definitely going to have to time and tune this thing. There are some not so great things about being a Mopar guy. All the parts are harder to find, everything costs 3 times as much, the electrical systems are often melted down, and you never, ever have a working fuel gauge. But one of the nicest things about wrenching on Mopars, the distributor. When it's 180 out like this one is, instead of having to chase a gear all the way around, you just pop it out and you flip the rotor around and then you pop it back down in. It almost couldn't be easier. That's because, of course, the drive on the distributor shaft is a straight slot. I've mentioned this before, but if you think you're gonna have to be tweaking your timing, especially say on the side of the road, or you plan to make various adjustments and do some testing, power tuning in the future, make sure you don't reef your distributor tight. Don't leave it floppy loose either. You wanna snug that hole down to the point that you can just turn the distributor, but it will stay where you put it. I just took a random stab on distributor position. So, we'll see what that gets us. Hey, the number 1 plug's still out. Oh, if I had a nickel for every time I'd done that, I'd have 3 nickels. Yeah, needs more timing. Again. Okay, we're getting there. Let's let that oil circulate and hopefully quiet that awful valve train noise. Oh, please quiet that awful valve train noise. Well, okay, maybe that's just what it's like. I'm backing it out, it's smoking like crazy, and I can feel a cylinder dropping out and coming back. In fact, maybe more than one. Quick tip, even if you do get your flare reef down, make sure you check it for leaks. I had that problem on a car recently and it was quite bad. Well, the valve noise is getting less pronounced, but it has not gone away. Also, we're missing the clip here, which means the cable could randomly come unhooked at any time. Whoa. Was that a spark? It sounded like a spark. Or was it? Huh. Oh, the pickup wire is wrapped up in the kickdown. Well, it's gotten better, but there's definitely a noisy one on this side. I'm gonna keep running it, we'll see if that quiets down. I'm also gonna tweak the timing and the idle mixtures. One of these days, I will actually think to film my entire 5-minute fix tuning process. I did do a video on that forever ago, but it probably bears repeating. Tweak the distributor by hand to get it to idle the best. I am still gonna check the timing with a light to make sure we're safe, but I kinda always do that first. The timing is the most important thing, and it needs to be at least close. Then I check the idle mixtures because it didn't sound right. That would be because they were 6 and 4.5 turns out. They're at 1.5 turns now, and it's way better. I bumped the idle speed up a little bit, revved it several times, and then I was able to bring the idle speed back down. Listen to this thing now. Not bad. Except the accelerator pump rod just fell out because it's not clipped either. I'm gonna go look for some random little bits of hardware, I guess. Oh, I know what the issue is here. This rod is upside down, which is also why the pump arm isn't in the right location. That clip is supposed to be on the top. The bottom doesn't get clipped because it sits against the body here and it can't fall off. So if I can get this clip out and not send it to Jesus, I'll flip that around. I did take the liberty of making sure the carburetor hardware was tight, which it is. I don't see any vacuum leaks or anything. And the longer it's run, the better the idle has gotten. It did randomly stall on me a few times, but it's not doing that now. Thankfully, running for a little longer, whatever residual gassy oil was in a lifter over there on the driver's side worked its way out, and it's now whisper quiet. I am relieved, let's just say that. When I first got the car fired up, it was definitely smoking. Far from the worst I've ever seen. Remember again, the entire inside of this engine was washed down with gasoline. That'll wipe out your ring seal pretty quickly. You really need to have oil on those rings for them to be effective. So now that we've gotten the gas out of there and it's running halfway decent, hopefully the ring seal will return 100-ish% and the thing won't be a smoker for life. Before I take this thing for a test drive, we noticed the headlights are like super dim and flashing when I rev the engine up, so obviously there are some issues. So here I am going through electrical gremlins. First off, I did remove that ground wire on the voltage regulator. I pulled that cowl cover and I put a nut on the back side of that bolt. You see, that bolt was loose because the hole in the firewall was stripped out. Those bolts just go into sheet metal, not at all uncommon, but I'm confident we've got a good ground now with that tight. As long as we've got a good body ground, and I'm not so sure we do, given that all we have is this. So I'm gonna make sure this is kind of sort of tight before moving on. Yeah, that should do something. I also tightened the crimp on these lighting grounds. Now I'm over here looking at this. This is the main power wire that feeds this car. Yeah, the stud's loose, I did that already. Notice it's not very big, and it's connected under here, under the main power wire, which is not tight enough. And it goes through a splice here, and then another crimp connector here. That wire is not up to the task of running the entire electrical system in this Cuda. I just went through almost this exact same thing in the black 1973 Challenger that I used to own. I replaced this chunk of wire, and it made a big difference. So that's what I'm gonna do here. The main power feed wire she tells you not to worry about. That's what I've come up with for that. Ring connector here, ring connector here. Nice 10 gauge wire, heat shrink, and this is actually tight. Note, this bolt is installed backwards, unfortunately, because of the way this battery is. Kind of has to be, or I would fix that. Anyway, can't possibly be worse. Well, it's not as much better as I would have hoped, but unfortunately, I don't really have time to dig into this any farther. Further issues are likely to be found in the bulkhead connector, but that's not what I'm here to mess with today. In fact, none of the electrical stuff really was. Getting it running awesome, that was my job, and I have done that. In fact, listen to this thing now. Nice. Yeah, it sounds pretty good. Might have something to do with the welded mufflers, I suppose, but that's a sweet running 340 now. My random earball put it at 15 base, 38 total. I backed it off to 35 total for safety, and it still sounds very happy. Let's take this thing for a drive. Hood pins engaged. You may have noticed in previous dash shots, as I did, that there's some gauge weirdness. For one thing, the amp gauge, alt gauge, or ammeter, whatever the heck you want to call it, Chrysler labeled it alt in this car, is stuck all the way to C for charge. The charging system is actually not putting out way more power than it should be. In fact, kind of the opposite. So I don't know what that's about. The oil gauge and temp gauge seem to work, and the fuel gauge is giving me good news. The tach does not read at idle, but if you rev the engine up, it does work. 340 Cuda, modern Challenger. The Imperial is for scale. Unfortunately, this is going to be just about the world's shortest test drive. I don't have time for anything else. And as usual, we won't be hot rodding this car because it is not mine, and it is quite nice, but we got to test it. Oh yeah, good power. Transmission shifts well, although I just remembered it hesitated to go in reverse, so really need to check the fluid. Is this third gear? I'm not even sure. It was. There's some weird burbling going on. I'm not totally sure what that's about. It died. I know why. This is not ideal. This was actually reefed tight. We always loosen these at night so we can disconnect the batteries. you know, to prevent electrical fires. I left this one loose for my test drive so I could do that when I get back, and yeah, it popped off. It really, really doesn't like fitting there. Fixed is fixed. Anyway, if you've watched the channel much, you know I'm not much of an E-body guy. I like them. They're attractive cars. It's just, they're not super spacious inside. They're not the most practical thing compared to a B-body. And that's why I got rid of my Challenger and kept my Charger. Slapstick works. I don't know if you can hear that little bit of hiccuping. Yeah, it's kind of surging. Unfortunately, I am completely out of time tonight, so I can't tune on it anymore right now. It is much better. I mean, it runs, so yeah, there's that. Did I mention the front tires are kind of cambered weird and this thing handles all goofy? Yeah, it needs an alignment. That too is not my problem tonight. I'll tell you what, this thing's pretty sweet. I even like the fuzzy dice. Yeah. No, the irony of saying I don't like E-body Cudas and Challengers, but then driving home in a modern Challenger with a completely useless backseat and a tiny trunk is not lost on me. This thing is awesome. I like it a lot. It's got all the right stuff. It's got the humps. It's got hood pins. It says Cuda 340 on it, and that is just great. I've spent quite a bit of time on this channel extolling the virtues of the Mopar 340 LA small block engine. It's a fantastic feat of automotive engineering, and I'm really glad this one didn't need any further surgery. It seems to have survived that whole experience with no problem. Yes, big blocks fit in these E-bodies, but the 340 is a pretty great match. That engine will scream if you ask it to. The one thing that knocks this Cuda out of competition for my favorite E-body, the lack of a third pedal and a pistol grip 4-speed shifter. Those things are important to me. Sure is cool though. Sounds great. Ooh, forward look wagon. Really crappy one. There is a reason why the E-body Cuda ranks #1 on many people's lists of favorite legendary muscle cars. It's got fantastic lines. The proportions are just right. They knocked off just the right amount of styling cues from General Motors. Oh yeah. Did I mention I'm out of time? I gotta go park this thing. Hey, this is your bi-weekly reminder that Dead Dodge Garage memberships are a thing. We have 3 different price levels with a cheap one, a slightly less cheap one, and an expensive one. Ask any of my gold members, I think there are like 23 of them, and they'll tell you it's definitely worth it. Probably. Still haven't gotten gold member gifts shipped out. Anyway, thank you for your consideration. Thank you for watching. And remember, it's not a Barracuda, it's a Cuda.